Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Yale Center for British Art. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shakticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking people, have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. Let me start by saying I am not Laurel Peterson. You were expecting Laurel, who is assistant curator of prints and drawings at the museum and a great collaborator of our speaker today, Holly Shaffer, to be introducing today's book launch. But alas, Laurel is isolating with suspected COVID. So we first of all wish Laurel and her family all the best for a very quick recovery or an escape from COVID, and I will do my level best to substitute. But we are all delighted to welcome Holly Shaffer to our program this afternoon. Hi, Holly, it's lovely to see you. Holly is assistant professor of the history of art and architecture at Brown University with a specialization in British and South Asian art and their intersections. And today we'll be talking about her new book, which I shall hold up, and which, if you do not already own it, you will purchase, because it's just a magnificent and very beautiful book, also thrilling book to read. Grafted Arts, Art Making and Taking in the Struggle for Western India, 1760 to 1910. This has just been published by the Paul Mellon Center with Yale University Press, spring 2022. And it's already won the American Institute of Indian Studies Edward C. Dimmock Jr. Book Prize in the Indian Humanities. Many of you with us in the room and joining us online will be familiar with Holly and her work from her time as a doctoral student at Yale, when she curated Adapting the Eye, an archive of the British in India, 1770 to 1830, a really memorable exhibition here at the Yale Center for British Art in 2011. She's published essays in the Art Bulletin, Art History, Journal 18, Modern Philology, and Third Text. And she edited the 2021 volume of Arts Orientalis on the graphic arts. Now, what am I doing here? Well, I was very delighted. My name's Tim Barringer. I'm Paul Mellon Professor of the History of Art across the street, and I was delighted to be one of Holly's advisors as she was here working on her dissertation. And I'm going to add a story about Holly before we even start, which is before I even ever met her, set eyes on her, I received an extraordinary email from a young Fulbright scholar who was at the time in Lucknow in India, exploring the idea of doing a PhD in the history of art, but actually talking for a full page about questions of intercultural exchange and food. And I hope at the end we'll get to hear a little more about Holly's interest in Indian food and its cultural history. But it was one of the most brilliant emails I've ever received. I actually took it to the person in the office next door to show, because it was so fascinating, and I thought, I hope she comes to Yale. She did, and the rest is history. Together, Holly and Laurel Peterson are at the moment curating an exhibition scheduled for the fall of 2025, provisionally titled Company Painting, Artists and the British East India Company, 1760 to 1830. So that will take place at the center in 2025, yeah. Now, Grafted Arts is, the thinking behind it is one of the jumping off points for that exhibition. And I'm going to ask Holly to draw out some of the ideas in the book which may inform the show as we move forward in our conversation today. And after the discussion, we'll take questions from the audience, both in person and online. So we'll bring a microphone to you at the end if you put your hand up. And for those tuning in remotely, please send your questions by email to ycba.programs@yale.edu. And I'll say that again at the end. So Holly, congratulations on this magisterial publication. We're going to talk a bit about the theoretical and historical arguments of the book in our conversation, but I wanted to open by paying homage to the revelatory research that underpins this book. Research conducted in many places, many museums, libraries, and archives using many languages. And actually, I want to open the book because the research is not just words. The research is the extraordinary campaign of images, many of which have never been reproduced before, many of which were discovered or identified and certainly interpreted in a more sophisticated way than ever before by Holly. And this book is very remarkable in that even if you don't read it, this is a secret, you can understand its argument because the illustrations are arranged in such a fashion that the book speaks through images as loudly as it does through words. Images which are beautiful, images which are gripping. So first of all, Holly, congratulations and a round of applause on publishing the book.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that beautiful introduction. And obviously, I'm so indebted to you as my advisor and mentor for so many years. And so I thank you. And I also want to thank, obviously, Laurel, who unfortunately is not able to be with us today, but will be and is so much a part of the ongoing work of this project at the Yale Center for British Art. And thank you to Courtney Martin, to Martina Droth, Gillian Forrester, who's no longer at the center, but also so much a part of this thinking, and to everyone else here and at my own university where I work at Brown. So thank you.
First big question, the title. It's quite an unusual title, Grafted Arts. The word graft, I want to just ask you to think through it a little more, but anyone who reads the Guardian newspaper, which is of course all civilized people, will have seen that this morning the word graft was part of a major political controversy in England, which in a way speaks to some of the meanings that you draw out of this word. Britain's new Prime Minister claims that my countrymen and women are the worst idlers in the world and that what they need is more graft to rescue the British economy. Thank you, Liz Truss, for that insight. Graft, then, it can mean hard labor, it can mean hard work, but it also has happier implications relating to horticulture. So what are grafted arts?
It's a great question. And graft as a concept came out of this remarkable etching by Robert Mabon, who was a British East India Company soldier who has a story himself. He, in a drunken fit, after gambling himself into debt, signed up for the company army in a stupor and begged people, especially Samuel Boswell, to get him out of this predicament. But that didn't work. And so he ended up shipping out to India. And he was a great draftsman and began to work for an artist who was also working in India named James Wales. And he produced this etching of a man, a bullock driver, named Kowasji. And what I hope you can start to see is that Kowasji, unfortunately, was captured by an enemy of the British. So he was working for the British East India Company Army when their enemy to the south captured him and their soldiers cut off his nose. And this print documents a remarkable procedure of repair by a Western Indian surgeon. And what they did was they took a piece of this man's forehead and twisted it around and over a newly modeled nose out of wax and grafted it to his face. And I looked at this print for a very long time, and then I suddenly wondered here the medical definition of graft is very clear, but I began to wonder, what does graft mean in Marathi, the language of Western India? And when I started to investigate, I realized that it is translated as one of the most important words for artistic style, called kalam in Marathi. And so together, graft as a medical procedure, a violent procedure, a potentially creative procedure, one that is connected to botany, where you have a bud grafted onto a tree to produce a new fruit, also has the root and definition of artistic style. This became really important because it became a way to think through arts that are made from multiples. How is it that art that comes from multiple sources is grafted together to make something new and different? So that's the making of art. But graft, as you just alluded to, also has the implication of taking money, the illicit gain of goods, plunder. And so together, in the quite tumultuous circumstances of Western India in this period, graft became a way to think through how these arts were both made and also how they were collected, plundered, looted. Another great image to think through this concept, again, of multiplicity, is this painting, which itself literally is grafted. So underneath the artist, whose name is now unknown to us, he took a British print of a soldier and embellished it, used it as a linear design and painted over it and added to it. He added these wonderful villages, the river with the fish, the dogs and the leaping deer, the garlands. He essentially domesticated it and even made it charming. But the circumstances in which this work was created, where you have British soldiers as well as Western Indian soldiers, known as the Marathas, coming together, created the circumstances for this print coming into this artist's orbit. Just one more object to kind of talk us through graft. We've briefly discussed how art can be made from multiple sources, as well as the circumstances of the production, both violent and creative. Graft also has this other meaning of plunder, loot. And this is another object that was kind of flushed out in the wars that consumed India in the late 18th and early 19th century. This is a statuette of the Hindu god Shiva and his consort Parvati, and it was collected or plundered by the company soldier named Edward Moore, who was embedded within the Maratha army in this period, and that's how he became attuned to objects of Hindu devotion. And he described so many of the objects that he gathered as having a defect or fracture as a result of these quite tumultuous circumstances. And you can actually see, again, in this image, how the top part is worn potentially from devotees touching the bronze, but Moore added the base because it had come separated. It had come to him as only a partial object. And so he sought to repair the image to whatever extent he was able. And that's where you can actually see the joint where the two metal alloys meet.
Grafting on many levels. So, Holly, in what you've just said, you've given us a sense that this was a period of tumult, of historical shifts and changes. Can you give us just a sketch, a context, so that members of our audience who haven't read the book can get a sense of what was going on? It's too easy, perhaps, for us to think of no empire and then empire, as if there was a simple switch from no British presence to a complete British empire in India. But you tell a very different story.
Yes, absolutely. And just to open with a map of late 18th century India. And again, just to say that there was no one power that was in control of the subcontinent in this period in the wake of the fragmentation of kind of the great Mughal Empire. But two powers, the Marathas and the British, what I like to think of as aspiring empires on the build, right? Very similar in certain ways, both premised on mercenary activity, selling themselves, making money through being soldiers, as well as through goods and other mercantile enterprises. The Marathas. So the Marathas and the British were both vying for power. And you can see here, these are Maratha terrains. The Marathas were Western Indian military chiefs who again rose to power in the 17th century to control a huge swath of India, even controlling the Mughal throne at points. The British also rose to power to a certain extent also in the 17th century. They came to India initially as businessmen and merchants, but soon became conquerors, initially of the northeastern state of Bengal and at key ports, Madras, present-day Chennai, and Mumbai, present-day Bombay, on the coasts. The Marathas and the British were both allies and enemies. They saw use value in each other, but also despised each other, and were in this kind of tense relationship. In the 1790s, they chose to collaborate, to ally against their mutual enemy to the south, known as Tipu Sultan of Mysore, who represented himself and his domains through the tiger, which is why you see, and here's one of many people's favorite object, a tiger organ munching on a British soldier. So you can see some of the dynamics of the period.
Great. I mean, you could talk for the rest of the afternoon about that, but that was a wonderfully clear introduction to some of the politics of the time. One of the names that I had never heard before you started your work, but someone I feel I know quite well through your work, is this fascinating character, Nana Fadnavis. Now, he was a Maratha patron and a minister at the court of Pune, but I think you actually describe him as someone who had a sort of aesthetic role, creating, if not art himself, then through patronage, creating a kind of iconography for this new Maratha force in India. So perhaps you could talk to us about Nana Fadnavis a little.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you're seeing a portrait of him on the screen right now that's in the Yale Center for British Arts collection. And just to kind of open the idea that one of the reasons why I ended up focusing on Nana Fadnavis was because both his interest in art and the records that also supported understanding those materials are still extant. And one of those key archives is here at the YCBA, which really is the source, started this book project. So Nana Fadnavis was a very, very powerful minister at the Maratha court in Western India, in their capital city of Pune. And Nana Fadnavis was fascinated by art. He showed an interest in collecting from a very early age. When he went to North India, to Delhi in the 1760s, he wrote an autobiography in which he talked about collecting paintings, particularly ones that were not indecent, which shows that he had a predilection for indecent activities, which he does discuss at different points in his writings. But he was very, very keen on Mughal paintings, which are some of the kind of most very, very highly refined and gorgeous works produced in early modern India. And here's one example of a painting from the Mughal court that he collected and compiled into an album. And this one's really wonderful because it also shows how the Mughals themselves used graft. And I should say that graft is the perfect tool of empire, right? Because if you want to bring together multiple constituents, it's the way to speak to multiple audiences. And so here you're looking again at an image of the Virgin Mary, but the artist here has added a bindi to her forehead and dressed her in a garment very akin to a sari. So Nana Fadnavis is collecting works of this very high caliber and reformatting them in borders to his own taste. So Nana Fadnavis is very, very interested in Mughal art, but we also see, as we look at more and more of his paintings, that he is specifically interested in places that he seeks to control or negotiate with. So he's looking to different types and styles of art connected to the domains that he, again, wishes to conquer or ally with. He also chose, from the works that are still available, we see how he starts to combine works of art together. And we're looking at one of those on the screen. Something else remarkable about Nana Fadnavis is, again, there are a lot of letters of his that are still extant in Marathi. And in some of them, he's writing to his agents that he wants Mughal paintings. He wants images of the Hindu gods. And his agents keep writing back to him saying, we're trying, we're desperately trying, but we can't find what you're looking for. This painting is kind of an amazing example of what happens in the face of a desire that can't be fulfilled. On the one hand, we have a background that's akin to a late Mughal painting of a scene of palace entertainment. So we know that Nana Fadnavis wants to draw Mughal paintings into his realm as kind of the elite status symbol of the period. But he's also interested in representing Hindu gods. And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing Vishnu and Lakshmi, Shiva and Parvati, and other gods very important in Western India being represented. And through visual analysis, we can see, or we can suggest, that this was his solution, to kind of graft these two traditions together in order to come to what he wanted.
Excellent. Maybe you could move on to the image of a British painting, which you included in the exhibition Adapting the Eye. Do you have that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, this one. Because I just wanted to spend a minute recalling that exhibition and the extraordinary experience of watching you as then a graduate student, now a very grand professor. But one of the stepping stones on the way was actually having the opportunity to curate a show in this amazing building. And I want to pay tribute to the Yale Center for British Art for making that possible, and also, for having the collections available for you to work on. And we should name Gillian Forrester as your close collaborator in that show. Could you just talk about the experience of putting a show together as opposed to working on a dissertation chapter as a different form of intellectual enterprise?
Yeah, absolutely. It was, and I'm so grateful to that experience. It was extraordinary because I was kind of given the opportunity just to do whatever. It just had to be connected to India, in the sense that it was related to an exhibition of Johann Zoffany, an artist who had spent time in India as well as other places in Europe. So when I started kind of working through the collection, looking at various materials, I started to look closely at this, again, incredible archive that is in the center. And it's connected to two people, Charles Ware Mallet, who was the first British ambassador, known as a resident at the Maratha court in Pune, and the artists that he hired, who also worked for the Maratha court. So James Wales, a Scottish artist, his assistant, that company soldier named Robert Mabon, and a local Pune artist named Gangaram, Chintaman Naugire Tambat, and a man named Jossi, who he described as being from Goa. So within this archive, you start to see the workshop practices of multiple artists in India. And there are also journals. Wales kept a journal, Mabon kept a slender journal, where he describes being under cave arrest. And we also see within so many of Gangaram's drawings that Gangaram inscribed many of them. So here's a scenario where you have so many different people that together tell this extraordinary story of the complexity of artistic production and the politics of Western India. And what we're seeing on the screen is one of the paintings that was produced from so many of these drawings that are here at the Yale Center for British Art. This is why Mallet was in Pune to negotiate a treaty with the ruler of the Maratha court in Pune, known as the Peshwa, who we see right here, and here's Mallet. And we see Nana Fadnavis, I don't know if you can recognize him right here, kind of the power behind the throne. And so this is a very large-scale oil painting, probably 6 to 9 feet across, now at Tate Britain. And it's interesting because you can almost see Wales struggling with how to compose this work, because the tradition is to have people seated on the ground, and then he's working to fill the space. And you can see that he's incorporating the decor, which is a frieze of the Hindu gods, as well as sculptures that are both in niches and represented on the exterior. And this image had always seemed kind of fascinating because it seemed to combine two elements. One, this history painting, but then also this interest in this, what are often called the manners and customs of people in India, which was a major subject in the project of colonialism, to gather knowledge about the people whom the British wanted to control. But then, after the exhibition, I came across this kind of astonishing work, which is of equal or larger size, that company soldier Edward Moore had collected, that I believe was also likely connected to Nana Fadnavis's patronage. Again, this is a very large-scale work, and it's done in a technique known as Rogani Ranga in Marathi, which is oil colors. That was a traditional technique in the area, but this painting is at the scale of a large-scale British oil painting, right? So an academic history painting. And this was quite common at this scale to do on walls in the region. But transferring it, and large paintings on cloth were also very common. But in this particular instance, it seems clear that the patron, who I think is likely connected to Nana Fadnavis, wished to engage with British history painting. And so we see that when we put these two together, they tell a fascinating story, right? Where here we see the players, Mallet, the Peshwa, at the Maratha court, overseen by the Hindu gods, looking over them. Whereas in the work, sorry, I keep pointing at the screen, whereas the work with, produced likely by the Maratha court, replaces the people with the gods themselves. But the two are clearly in dialogue, in conversation.
I'm just looking there. Because just look at the screen, only Holly Shaffer could put those two pictures together, and that's the grafted arts. You can see a South Asian painting in dialogue with English practice, and an English painting in which South Asian culture is inscribed. That's the excitement of this scholarship. I think it's really fascinating. You also mentioned a figure who's become a firm favorite in these parts since you disinterred his work from the archive, and that's Gangaram, Chintaman, Tambat. Do tell us more about Gangaram, because he's really one of the most vivid presences in your book.
Gangaram, so this is one of Gangaram's self-portraits. Gangaram was an artist in Pune in the late 18th century, and he's kind of one of the stars, or someone who really emerged from the archive at the Yale Center for British Art, who left a lot of information about himself, though of course we can't know everything by any means. But very little is known about many artists in this period in India, and especially artists who worked outside of court contexts. And so the fact that Gangaram both portrayed himself many times and wrote a lot of information about what he was doing and where he was going, as well as drawing so many other people that he was connected to, provides this incredible opportunity to learn about an artist in 18th century Western India. So here we see, again, Gangaram very confident drawing on a drawing pad. And we can also see him in his work for Charles Ware Mallet, who was one of his employers. Gangaram also clearly worked for other patrons, and we see this in the archive as well. He worked with very similar compositions that are common in other collections in Pune, and he also copied works such as from other parts of India as well. So you can see that this is someone who was immensely skilled and working in multiple modes. What we're seeing on the screen is Gangaram in documenting, likely himself and 3 other Indian artists, using a type of viewing device, which is likely a vertical camera obscura that James Wales wrote in his diaries he had invented the previous day. So it's kind of amazing. But he's clearly using a type of viewing device to draw the temples on the hill that were, again, one of the primary sites very important to the Maratha rulers of this region. And this drawing is so fascinating because it's showing the act of surveillance, essentially. That, again, Mallet, he's a company official. He's very keen to create an alliance with the Marathas. And in that process, he wants to gather as much information as possible about, again, the people that he both wants to ally with, but also eventually would be keen to control. So there's clearly a colonial intent here that we're witnessing.
Share some more Gangaram. Cool stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Next slide. Yeah, because
Yeah.
no one can resist.
No one can, yeah. So
the rhino.
Gangaram also was a very keen portrayer of animals. Again, likely he was commissioned by Mallet to portray animals in the Maratha rulers' menagerie, as well as in Mallet's own collection of animals. Animals were gifted between rulers, collected as a form, again, of being a kind of upper-class person. And here we're looking at a rhinoceros. And it might seem familiar to some of you as it's part of, it seems connected to earlier trains of visual images of rhinoceroses that go back to Albrecht Dürer's famed print. Gangaram definitely looked at a dictionary of arts and sciences that Mallet owned, which probably accounts for that lineage, but he also absolutely observed the animals from life, and that's what we're seeing. That documentation of the length of different parts of the rhinoceros is written in Marathi as well as Mallet's transcription in English. We also see Gangaram in some ways departing from that tradition of European natural history illustration, especially with his sculptures, the wax sculptures of animals that he did, such as this lion that Mallet recorded as being rather mangy. But when you look at it, and this lion is very beloved by many, that you can see that Gangaram has depicted it with vitality and pathos. And the sculpture is about this big, just to give you a sense of scale. In the same way that Gangaram was instructed to go to the Maratha ruler's menagerie to depict animals, again, almost as a sense of spying or intelligence, or gathering intelligence, painters employed by the Maratha court, such as Shivram Chittari, also depicted Mallet. So they were also observing Mallet and his practices. And here we see this incredible painting, again, by an artist named Shivram Chittari, employed by the Maratha court, that likely depicts Charles Ware Mallet at the center with his hunting dogs, surrounded by animals. And again, you can see some of the interaction between artists, where the animals in this painting, each on their lime green tuft, seem to suddenly pop out as Gangaram's 3-dimensional sculptures. So you see these kind of moments of intersection between, in this case, a court artist and a popular artist engaging and feeding off of each other.
Holly, we don't have too much time left, but I do want to ask you about a key phrase in your book, and one which is going to be the central theme in your forthcoming exhibition: company painting, company school. It has resonances back in the history of British art, but you've taken it and, as it were, inverted it or turned it inside out in really interesting ways. Perhaps you could just quickly define it or redefine it for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's just go to this fantastic new acquisition at the center. So the term company painting was popularized by a woman named Mildred Archer in the 1940s. She was the wife of a colonial official in India, returned to Britain in the year of the partition of India, and became a keeper of paintings at the British Library, so the key colonial institution. And even though the term itself came to be through a group of Indian and British art historians and artists, which I'm working on with my colleague Yutika Sharma at Northwestern, it evolved through Mildred Archer's work at the British Library into a much stricter racial and hierarchical term, meaning Indian artists who worked for the British and used certain techniques like shading and perspective, as well as they were attracted to certain types of subject matter, like manners and customs, portraiture, natural history, and landscape and architecture. And we're looking at one incredible painting within that natural history genre on the screen. The goal of the show that I'm co-curating with Laurel Peterson is to rethink this term, to both acknowledge that the company is a global, powerful force that shaped aesthetics, but at the same time, think about the multiple artists from diverse skill sets that participated in their work under the company's auspices. So Indian, Chinese, and British artists, those are who we'll be focusing on within the exhibition. And this is one painting that we're looking at by Bhavani Das, who worked for a woman named Lady Impey, wife of a company judge in Calcutta. And Bhavani Das is trained in a Mughal manner, and you see this incredible skill in depicting the bat. And if you can, I hope everyone can see the eyes that seem to kind of, brighten with animation on the screen. So he's coming from a Mughal manner, but and there is a very long tradition of painting natural history within from the Mughal court. But that blank sheet behind the bat, the way the bat is splayed, is clearly connected to a European natural history project. So we're seeing this as a type of company work, someone who's working for a company patron, participating in this type of subject matter, but also can be seen in many different lights.
Wonderful. So this is grafted art.
Yeah, this is exactly.
And the company school, which has really been treated as somehow second rate in relation to South Asian traditions and kind of second rate in relation to British traditions by some traditional scholars, will now emerge as something quite different and unique. So we're all really looking forward to this exhibition. Let's have a very brief conversation about Edward Moore, because it's quite unusual to find a soldier essentially featuring in an art history book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Edward Moore in some ways takes us from the making of arts, the making of grafted arts, to the taking of art. Again, Moore's a soldier. He's embedded within the Maratha army as they're fighting Tipu Sultan in the south. And this is where he kind of becomes interested in collecting images of the Hindu gods, but also keenly aware of how objects are moving in this period, circulating through plunder, through that other definition of graft, illicit gain. And we're looking at, on the screen, a statuette of Lakshmi, the Hindu goddess of wealth, wrote used to be in the home shrine of Nunna Fadnavis before it was plundered. So Moore offers this avenue into the many art markets of the period, many connected to tumult and plunder, loot, and destruction. And just to give a sense that these types of work, in Moore's collection, they're out of context, right? He takes them and he's using them towards his own ends. But we can see them in a domestic space. For example, this is actually one of the descendants of Gangaram. So it's a contemporary scene, so from a very different time period. But you can see a very, very similar image of Lakshmi in the corner. So just to give you a sense of context. But Moore collected so many of these images went on his route with the Maratha army and afterwards when he was based in Pune. And so you can see a kind of another archive of his at the British Museum that shows that.
So Edward Moore publishes a volume which then infiltrates British art and British consciousness. And perhaps you'd like to talk to us about that. In particular, its influence on really major British cultural figures like William Blake.
Yeah.
Perhaps we can go straight to Blake.
So Edward Moore collected, again, over 600 paintings and sculptures while he was in Western India. And when he returned to England, he hired artists to kind of transform them into engravings for his 1810 publication, The Hindu Pantheon. And what we're seeing here is how you can move from an 18th century sculpture of Ganesha, the elephant-headed Hindu god, to the drawing by the artist he hired, to the engraving. And part of Moore's goal was to connect or relate the Hindu gods with the pantheon of the Greco-Roman gods of antiquity. So to connect India to other antiquities, that was kind of his Orientalist project. And it connects to William Blake, whose great hand-colored manuscript of Jerusalem is in the Yale Center for British Arts collection. Here you're looking at the title page. While many of us know Blake today as kind of a radical painter, printer, and poet, he made a lot of his money by being what's known as a reproductive engraver, so making works for other people's publications. And Blake likely learned about Moore's Hindu pantheon because he did reproduce one of the sculptures that you're seeing in an essay on sculpture for an encyclopedia. And so you're seeing that translation that Blake himself is doing. But Blake read the book closely, and we can see that in his adaptation of Hindu imagery, such as in this beautiful, his image on the right in Jerusalem of a woman in repose. She's on a sunflower with kind of butterfly wings coming out, extending from her back. And you can see how that relates to the iconography of the Hindu gods in Moore's book. So the goddess on a lotus, for example. And I'm just showing you that chain from the book to the painting that informed it. And it's almost as if Blake was able to see through the Hindu pantheon engravings to that colorful painting from Pune underneath. But we also see that he was very interested in the content of the Hindu pantheon, especially connected to goddesses and this movement from repose into action. Jerusalem as a project, his project in Jerusalem is for Britain to be revived, to regain virtue, to fight back against what he saw as the tyranny and empire that had ruined the country. And he saw this through the personification of Britain in a man named Albion, who you're seeing on the screen. And one thing that I've observed by reading the Hindu pantheon sections that it seems he was most interested in with the final pages of Jerusalem is that Blake seemed to draw from Hindu mythology in the same way that he was drawing from Christian evangelical texts, as well as Greek ones in his reinvention of his own mythology to revive Britain. And you can see how in his image, in the sculpture of Durga, the great goddess Durga that he copied and described as being in revolutions of action and repose, that you can see that form twisting and turning in that of his revivification of Britain in Albion. And at another point, I'm delighted to discuss how I think Blake compresses time in this image and goes through Greco-Roman and Hindu time in the processing of his own mythology. But this is just a brief glimpse into how he incorporated the Hindu gods into his own process.
Thank you, Holly. You've persuaded us, I think, that what happens in Western India actually has a profound impact on metropolitan art production in London, and that one of the great works, one of the treasures of this collection, is in fact deeply, deeply influenced by these figures that you've disinterred from the archive. Just for a concluding thought then, I wanted to take you to the end of your book when you have a self-reflexive moment, thinking about your own position as researcher in relation to the archives that you've worked with. And actually, I just wanted to say, you have to unlock those archives with things like learning Marathi, which we need to acknowledge is really significant, the work you did in mastering the languages which are necessary to unlock these cases metaphorically as well as literally. But can you talk to us, just to conclude, about why archives matter to us now?
No, thank you. And this was a part of the process of the long process of writing a book, is different characters and people are revealed over time. And so many of the figures that I first learned about while working on the Adapting the Eye exhibition in that Charles Wormell at James Wales Archive at the Yale Center for British Art, which you're seeing one image of on the left, I started to want to find other, how do you lock this information into other pieces of information to tell stories? And what I began, again, over my dissertation research to realize was that what you find in one archive can be complemented in another, but there can also be gaps. And the two kind of broad archival themes that became apparent was that colonial archives clearly left India and remain in American institutions or British institutions, whereas a lot of the Maratha archives remained in Western India, in part because of the Western Indian nationalist movement in the late 19th century. So this is before the nation state of India was founded. Anti-colonial nationalists started to gather materials to write their own histories that would rebut what colonial histories were saying about their own past. And what you're seeing is one of those archival cabinets in an archive in Pune that I spent a lot of time, the Bard Itihas Sanchodak Mandal. And it was only through kind of bringing together many of these archives that more of this, the way to tell at least a more complete story came into focus. But what also happened within that is you realize how much is missing, how much you don't see. Because the stories that I ended up telling were about figures who offered enough, whose stories remained enough, either in pictures or records, that clicked together. But then there are those that didn't, right, who I couldn't speak about as much. And so it became very important to me to discuss how my own method was also one of graft, grafting different archives together, different characters to tell a story, but also to acknowledge those gaps that are missing from archives and that we cannot access. And maybe I can conclude just on one anecdote where, as we discussed, Gangaram's this quite special figure within the book and within the Yale, the YCBA's collections. And Gangaram, this is one drawing by him of a palace in Ahmednagar named Fariabad. And again, this is one of those drawings that I never quite knew what to do with. What's happening here? But I started to realize that Gangaram's guru, so someone very special to him, likely lived near Ahmednagar. He had drawn his guru multiple times with fellow devotees. And so I decided I should go to Ahmednagar just to see if I could find out something more about Gangaram. And so I went to Ahmednagar, and through actually the president at this society in Pune, with his help, he connected me to a journalist who also became very interested in this project and published something in a local newspaper, asked if any of Gangaram's descendants were still alive. And one man wrote back to him and said, yes, I have a family tree. And so I went back to Ahmednagar and met Vilas Nagire, whose great-great-grandfather and Gangaram's great-father were related, were brothers. And in the book, this is only a footnote, but the trip became really significant to me because it showed this collapse in time. Like, what happens when different temporalities meet? And the person who I wanted to share this with was the artist, photographer, and bookmaker, Dayanita Singh, whose interest in file rooms and different layers of events has always spoken to and influenced my own. And so when Dayanita said she wanted to come to Pune, I suggested she go to Ahmednagar. And these are the contact sheets that resulted of her time spent there. And you can see that same garden palace, but you can also see a tank museum, graffiti of love between RK, I think it's RK and SS, trees, power lines, a printing press, a Hindu god, these kind of different moments, moods that were evoked for her in this place. And I just found this a really poignant way to conclude the book as a way to think through what we as art historians, how we're subjective, right? How what we focus on in archives and places is in some ways related to who we are and what we're interested in, and to be as careful with history as possible, but to also acknowledge what you can't access. And so it's with that I just wanted to reflect on graft as a method that for me really helped me understand this particular material, but could also work for, help anyone think through grafted arts in their own subjects and in whatever way.
Holly, thank you so much. You can see that Holly is the most remarkable storyteller, most remarkable researcher, but also grafting in horticulture is a way of giving life to things. And I think your great achievement is to take these archives to bring them to life. So thank you, Holly. Now we do have a couple of minutes for questions. So does anyone have a question for Holly? Comment, thought?
I was really interested in your date span, 1760 to 1910, and thinking even your date span speaks to a totally different global worldview. Can you give us the kind of bookend dates for that? Because just looking at it from, both from the Americas, but also from Britain and a little bit from Europe, you're looking east, but you're also looking east and west with that date range.
Yeah, that's such an amazing question. Thank you. And it's one that I thought a lot about, and it changed. It changed from being more 18th century focused to acknowledging how important this late 19th century kind of regeneration of the material was to the project. 1760 is both the moment when the British really started to gain power in India, and it's also when the Marathas, it's when they lose, it's right on the verge of their losing this major battle at Panipat, which hurt their empire, but then inspired certain figures like Nana Fadnavis to gain immense power and to rebuild their empire. So it became significant for these two competing empires, or empires in motion, empire builders. So that's the 1760. But I know it doesn't quite fit, because usually it would be the 18th century, right, which would be the long 18th century would be, starting in the late 1600s, moving into the early 1900s. And then initially I was going to stop it in the early 1800s, but that also didn't make sense, because so much of the second part of the book, the taking part, really focuses on how these Western Indian arts were reused and reformulated over time. And so with Edward Moore, the Hindu Pantheon is published in 1810, but all of those people who reuse it, especially colonial designers, missionaries, and then figures like William Blake, extend throughout the 19th century. And then in the late 19th and early 20th century, Western Indian nationalists from about 1878 start to gather and republish a lot of these earlier arts, including the British arts like James Wales's painting, many of his paintings, and so many of the other ones. They start to republish in this revival movement. And so I ended up stopping it at 1910 at the founding of a society in Pune, a historical society that cemented this kind of gathering of information. So that was how I ended up choosing those two dates.
More thoughts or questions for Holly? Well, we are just after 5 o'clock, so I think at that point we can say buy a copy of Grafted Arts, and let's congratulate Holly once more on this really remarkable achievement.
And thank you, Tim, so much for that amazing interlocution. And again, to thank Laurel Peterson for all of her work on this project and for the future exhibition on company painting.
Absolutely. Feel better, Laurel, if you're watching. Yes. Great. Thank you all.